Hello and welcome to another conversation with the Middle East Monitor. My name is Nasim Ahmed and I will be your host for today's conversation. Earlier this month, over 40 leading crime scholars, including major intellectual figures, issued a statement, one of a number of statements that have been issued, warning that Israel has entered an annihilation phase of genocide. As I said, the statement is one of many that have been issued, calling on the international communities to stop Israel's genocidal campaign on Gaza. And this campaign did not begin, as this statement goes on to say, on October 7, 2023 for Palestinians. The genocidal process began in 1917 with the Balfour Declaration, when Britain gifted Israel, the country, to European Zionists. And for me, that's the statement, that's the paragraph that stands out from the other statements, that it made a historical connection between what is happening in Gaza and what is happening and the Balfour Declaration. So I have with me one of the leading signatories of that statement, Professor Penny Green, Professor of Law and Globalization at Queen Mary University, London, and the founder and co-director of International State Crime Initiative. Welcome to the show, Penny Green, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Nasim. Before
we get into the statement itself, I think it's important for our viewers to know who the signatories are. Of course, you're one of the many signatories. I say that because there's a strange tendency when it comes to Israel-Palestine conflict to discredit experts and academics on any given issue. I mean, look at the apartheid designation, for example, where people who are qualified to make such determination, like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, B'Tselem, professors of the crime of apartheid itself, they are ignored in favor of Israeli state official statements or basically propagandist on the mainstream media. I think it's important for viewers to know the level of professional knowledge and expertise that is behind this particular statement that you managed to put together earlier this month. So who are these experts that you've gathered for this statement?
Well, we at the International State Crime Initiative decided we needed a statement that really experts on state crime, and genocide is one of the most egregious forms, obviously, of state criminality. And we wanted to get together a statement that expert scholars in state crime would sign and contribute to the writing of the statement. So we initiated the statement because our whole approach to understanding state crime is not wholly legal. I mean, there's a real problem when you're looking at states and criminal behavior, because states make laws and they're notoriously unwilling to define any of their behavior as criminal from the perspective of the legitimacy of their actions. And so I think it's very important for us as state crime scholars, people who've worked on a whole range of state crimes from a criminological perspective and a legal perspective, to get together to really call out Israel's actions as genocide, because that is what is happening. Now, the signatories are global experts in a whole range of state criminality. So we have, for example, Richard Falk is one of the signatories. Richard Falk was, in fact, a former UN Special Rapporteur for the occupied Palestinian territories. Hilal Elva is another state crime scholar who is also a special rapporteur, but in a different area. We have a number of American scholars of state crime who look at a whole range of state corporate collusion. And we have scholars such as Phil Scraton, who perhaps is best known for his amazing work on the Hillsborough disaster and the way in which police were involved in the killing of the way in which that whole football stadium was managed, and the policing of that stadium meant that some 90 football fans were killed. So we have a range of scholars who work on a range of forms of state crime, and a number of us are actually, our major area of expertise is in genocide. So we have Louise Wise, whose expertise is on the Sudanese, the Darfur genocide. Thomas McManus and I have worked for over a decade on the Rohingya genocide. So it's a range of scholars who have expertise in and around state criminality, and quite a number of the group are experts in genocide itself.
And on this particular statement that was issued, are you looking just specifically at genocide? I'm assuming there's so many other crimes that are taking place. I mean, one of the clear ones we could mention is ethnic cleansing, and that seems to be an obvious one. And there's so many other crimes of violations of international law and crimes against humanity, like the targeting of civilians, you could say. There's so many other state crimes that are taking place. So is it just genocide, or are you looking at more broadly at state crime that are being perpetrated in Gaza?
Well, I think what's very valuable about a state crime approach to what's happening in Gaza and Palestine more generally is that it captures genocide and the crimes that are embodied in genocide, like apartheid, and so on. It embodies genocide as a process. The problem is, if you start on October the 7th, you are understanding genocide from a very limited frame, and that is the frame of a spectacularized incident of mass violence. But that is not what genocide is. Genocide is the intent to destroy in whole or part a people on the basis of their ethnicity, their religion, their race, their nationality. So that's in essence what Raphael Lemkin, who was the author of the very term genocide, had in mind, and that's embodied also in the Genocide Convention. But the problem with international law and taking only an international legal position is that the law moves very slowly, that it requires a particular kind of evidence, that it never calls out genocide until well after the fact. So I think the value of understanding state crimes as processes that very often, even if we take state crimes like torture, they start with processes of dehumanization, of targeting a particular group that are unworthy of our of moral responsibility, that we don't owe this group anything, they're not like us. And that is particularly true of the state crime of genocide. So it's very important, I think, to understand genocide as a process. And within that process, there will be a whole range of different forms of criminality that we can talk about. And we've mentioned apartheid. Now, Desmond Tutu described the kind of apartheid that operates inside Israel-Palestine is worse than that operated inside South Africa. And anybody who's been to the West Bank will recognize that. It is so shocking to see the wall and the segregation wall, and the way it's not a separation barrier, it's a segregation wall, and it's designed also to grab land. Every kilometer of that wall that's built also grabs Palestinian territory. And another feature of that whole process of segregation is to actually break up Palestinian communities. So the wall cuts through Palestinian villages, making journeys for Palestinians immensely difficult, much, much longer than they ever took in the past, because now they have to go through checkpoints. And to get whether or not you have access to a checkpoint depends on whether the Israeli soldiers are prepared to let you through at a particular time. They very often just simply close a checkpoint. So there are many crimes embodied in the crime of genocide. But I think we really need to start by thinking about that original idea of what genocide is, and that genocide can take place actually without mass killing. Mass forced eviction would be enough to actually meet the definition of genocide. And so what we have in Gaza and in Palestine more generally, historically, is a combination of both mass forced evictions, which we saw in 1948, where 750,000 Palestinians were forced from their land in order to make way for the new state of Israel. Sorry.
No, that's what I mean. That's what I liked about this particular statement. It didn't look at Gaza in an isolated way. Yeah, you looked at the whole occupation of Palestine and took the long-term view into consideration. And genocide, as you mentioned, it is an incremental step, and it didn't just begin, as you said, on the 7th of October. And what's happening in the West Bank is also part of the story, whereas many people have been trying to divide Gaza, not just spatially, but also within the narrative that Gaza is somehow something different, but it's not. It's all part of one single occupation. And I think that's important to emphasize, and you do that very well in that statement. But what you do also say, yes, it started with the Balfour Declaration, this ongoing process of expulsion and getting to and genocide. You mentioned that what we are seeing in Gaza is the annihilation phase of genocide. So what specifically led you to characterize it in that way? That we are now seeing an annihilation phase, just instead of, because we've seen wars before, 2014, 2012, 2008, 9. But there's you specifically mentioned this is the annihilation phase, and I'm quoting the statement itself. So what specifically led you to say this is where we are at the moment in Gaza?
I think it's interesting when we think about genocide, because it's quite hard to shift that common sense mentality that it is an event. And that's the way in which the law constructs genocide, as an event. Genocide's not an event. It occurs slowly, it occurs over many years very often, sometimes decades, as with the case of both the Rohingya in Myanmar and with the Palestinians. And I've just run through the phases which are generally very apparent in all genocides, and they can exist concurrently. It's not necessarily one phase moves into the next, but we start with dehumanization strategies. And these will be official strategies where one group, the target group, the group that the state desires to remove, is represented in such a way as to be othered. They're not like the rest of the community. They may, in the case of the Rohingya, they were described as terrorists, they were described as illegal Bengalis, they were described as less than human, they were described as cockroaches. And we see this in all genocides. There's an idea that the target group don't deserve the same rights and privileges that we do. They don't deserve the same human rights because they're less than human. And we've seen that very explicitly in the case of Gaza, but it's not just at this moment. This has taken place for decades in Palestine. Palestinians have been treated in a way which is second class when compared to Israeli citizens. Those Palestinian Israelis who live inside Israel are treated as second class. Palestinians inside Jerusalem are treated as second class. Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza are treated as third class. It's a very common feature, and it starts with those kinds of strategies, institutionalized discrimination. And then when you have that process of discrimination and dehumanization, and the target group is stigmatized in such a way as that they don't feel like us, they aren't the same as us, we don't owe them the same kind of consideration and obligation that we owe each other as citizens. Once that takes place, you create a situation in which sporadic and litmus testing violence can take place. And when I talk about litmus testing violence, I mean you can have attacks. And we see this in the West Bank all the time with the settler movement, that the settlers attack Palestinian farmers, they attack a whole range of Palestinian laborers, and they get away with it. And because they get away with it, they do it again, and they do it more. And actually what we're seeing in the West Bank right now, under the cover of Gaza, is a huge uptake in violence in the West Bank. And that's very important to understand. And I think that this has been going on for decades, this kind of treatment. And once you have that kind of violence, and it's very much a feature of the settler colonial project, that the settlers will do anything in order to take over the land that they want.
So in your case, would I be correct in saying that even before the current bombardment of Gaza, you would have described, or scholars who've signed this statement, that what is happening in Palestine is actually genocide?
Yes,
irrespective of what is happening in Gaza right now. You're just seeing Gaza as the annihilation phase of the process of genocide. So would that be correct?
Yes, largely. I think that, you know, people have talked about the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, but ethnic cleansing is a euphemism. It's not actually a specific crime under international law, and I think it's much more of a euphemism. And I think if it effectively means genocide, you know, that kind of the way in which people describe ethnic cleansing and write about the cleansing of a particular population on the basis of their ethnicity or nationality or race or religion is effectively genocide. And I much prefer the term genocide, because I think it clouds the waters. And it also means that under international law, states aren't obligated to act, to intervene, to prevent and punish, which they are under the Genocide Convention if they call out a genocide. So I think I don't particularly like the word ethnic cleansing. I think it's quite descriptive, but it's not a particularly helpful term. But I would say, yes, that this is a genocide. And people have talked about the ethnic cleansing. Ilan Pappé wrote an excellent book on the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. But to my mind, it's the genocide. And the genocide did begin effectively in 1917 when the Balfour Declaration was made, and Britain, a colonial power, gave away a country, effectively Palestine, to Jewish Zionists. And so I think it begins then. And once we have these earlier phases of genocide, once we've had the litmus testing violence phase of genocide, you find that, and it's not always once, it can happen concurrently, that the target group becomes ghettoized. And Israel has done that very, very obviously in terms of the West Bank, the carving up of the West Bank, the carving up of Gaza, the imprisonment of the Gazan population. So you have these major ghettos, and then you have institutional ghettoization in terms of the way in which Israeli Arabs are treated, Israeli Palestinians are treated. So, you know, the Israeli state has removed Arabic as an official language. Now, that is a way of isolating Palestinian Israelis. It's a way of demoting them as citizens. And there are various other ways in which that's done. And of course, if you think about the West Bank and you think about Gaza, these enclaves, which are massively controlled, if you like. I mean, the security apparatus that Israel has at its disposal is highly sophisticated and immense. And so Palestinians who live in the West Bank do not have freedom of movement. They do not have equal rights to build homes for them and their families. They do not have equal rights in terms of voting. It's an apartheid system. Equally, Gaza is a very clear example of a mass ghetto. And in these isolated spaces, in these ghettos, it's much easier to systematically weaken this population that you want rid of. that the state wants rid of. And in the case of the West Bank, it's through, denying people basic human rights that I've just mentioned, but also imposing a settler colonial project, so that constantly Palestinians are deprived of water and access to decent roads, because the settlers take the water, and the settlers destroy, alongside the Israeli Defense Forces, destroy the olive groves and apricot orchards that the Palestinians have. So you have a situation in which the very livelihood, the opportunities for livelihood are really undermined, and massive unemployment in the West Bank. Young kids see their parents humiliated by the Israeli Defense Forces, by settlers constantly. It's a situation in which that seeks to weaken the population, both physically and emotionally. Gaza is very, very explicit in that way, because, of course, Israel for the last 17 years has imposed a blockade, an illegal blockade, and controls everything, every item of food, every building item in terms of construction materials, medical supplies. Israel controls everything that goes in and out of the Gaza Strip, and that includes human beings. So that's why people talk about Gaza as the largest open-air prison.
Open-air prison. I was got to ask a question about just zooming out a bit, and response of the UK and other Western governments, US, of course, and the general complicity, and relate that to what you mentioned earlier, that usually what happens with genocide is that it's usually a determination or designation after the fact. When the genocide is actually taking place, it's very difficult, or it's really hugely contested, especially if it's a Western ally, to get that determination or get that designation accepted. It's a major challenge, and that's why we're seeing such pushback from the UK and Israeli supporters of Israel. And do you think this is one of those examples where the UK will still maintain its position, the US and the West will generally maintain their positions, and it's only the historians who will be able to finally conclude and say that what happened is genocide? Or are we seeing, because of the outrage, because of the huge amounts of protests we're seeing around the world, that this will not be one of those cases, and it's going to become consensus amongst, because it's a huge thing for a generation to grow up thinking Israel has committed genocide. That's a huge stain on the UK, on the US, and the legitimacy they hold, and the so-called liberal order which they police and have erected. So two questions. So do you think there's a responsibility on the US and the UK that they are complicit in the genocide? And do you think, this act of genocide will be different to, say, other acts where it's only historians after the fact that they say there's a genocide taking place, or genocide had taken place?
I think that there's no doubt that the Biden administration in America for decades are utterly complicit in the ongoing genocide against the Palestinian people, and the same with the UK government. I don't think there's any doubt whatsoever about that. And there's no doubt that they will not come to kind of see the light. They're not about to make a genocide determination. They are not about to say enough is enough. I think that we've seen, I mean, in the vote in Parliament yesterday, that they're not even prepared to vote for a ceasefire. And I mean, Israel wouldn't exist. Israel wouldn't have any military capacity if it wasn't for the United States and the $3.8 billion a year that it funds that military. Without the United States, this genocide would not happen. And so I think that, yes, they are utterly complicit. I think what's interesting is the as you talked about, how the massive outrage that ordinary people are expressing, the extraordinary demonstrations that we're seeing around the world, and civil society really doing a tremendous amount to, in effect, expose what's going on as a genocide, not simply as a war, or not simply as Israel in self-defense strategy. I mean, that's the kind of arguments that we have to contend with. And of course, this isn't self-defense. I mean, you know, Israel has a right to protect itself. It does not have the right as an occupying power to act in this disproportionate form of self-defense against a threat that emanates from the occupied territory. It simply doesn't have that right. But I don't think we should expect anything from the United States, and I don't think we should expect anything from the United Kingdom in terms of our governments and in terms of doing anything about this. I think where we're going to have the kind of reaction that any moral person would have at watching, at this stage, around 12,000 people being slaughtered, 5,000 of them children, we're going to rely on ourselves. We're going to rely on civil society. And I think civil society has been organising extremely powerfully. And I don't think it's enough. I don't think the demonstrations are enough. But I think one of the great strategies that civil society has within its reach is the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement, BDS, which was started by Palestinians and in very much the same vein as the boycott movement in apartheid South Africa began. It was Black South Africans and it's Palestinians who are urging the world to boycott Israeli products and Israeli institution and Israeli institutional arrangements, particularly, say, in universities. So I think that there are strategies that civil society will engage in, but I don't think we can expect anything from our governments who have acted with utter complicity and shame. Coming to your question about will it only be the historians? Well, I think the genocide debate has been less difficult, actually, than in many other than, say, in the case of Myanmar. That was quite a difficult case to argue. I mean, a genocide's a difficult case to argue when it comes to major human rights organizations too, because major human rights organizations are very bound by the letter of international law, and they really wait for determinations by courts of law, the ICC or the ICJ. But if you wait for those courts, if you wait for the United Nations, you'll wait forever. So I think genocide scholars now are divided. There's no doubt that it's a divided community, but I think a very significant number of genocide scholars are saying this is genocide and this is genocide now. And I think that historians will certainly, if they're worth their salt, and if they're good scholars, they will see this absolutely as a genocide. So I think, yes, the historians, we can't expect anything from the international legal order. I think that's utterly failed the Palestinians. Israel has violated 28 UN
Security Council resolutions.
Exactly. Israel has violated 28 Security Council resolutions at no cost to itself. There have been no repercussions for those violations. International law has no teeth. The ICJ and the ICC move very slowly, and many, many years after the event, as they see it, the event, because they don't understand it as a process, they don't intervene at earlier stages. And so I think that we have to definitely rely on civil society. And I mean, it's civil society when it comes to state criminality. It's civil society that exposes, names as crimes, these actions of the state, and then goes about to sanction them. It actually has more impact in sanctioning, because boycotts are very, very powerful, you know. And Israel.
So on that, I want to ask one final question before we wrap up on civil society. I was listening to a talk by Professor Rashid Khalidi. He's got well-known academic and figure a number of books on Israel-Palestine. In an interview last week, and he said, this issue has been his primary concern for the last, I would say, 50, 60 years. And he said, never in those decades has our side, meaning the Palestinian side, been this strong. Do you sense that? I mean, you've been covering Israel-Palestine for such a long time. I mean, I definitely sense that, but I'm much younger, and I see that there's a generation who have grown up and seen the light on this issue, and that there is no way of monopolizing information in the way it used to be, and propagandizing to prevent people from seeing truth and the reality of the occupation, the nature of the occupation. So just one final thought. I mean, so do you, in your experience, do you think the tide has turned and the pro-Palestinian side have really gained the narrative or have control over the narrative, and our side is winning? Is that how you feel as well?
Well, I don't think that the Palestinian side is winning in the sense that every day hundreds of Gazans are being slaughtered. I mean, I think, and the whole infrastructure of Gaza is being utterly decimated. But I do think that there's a new awareness. I certainly, and I think it's largely to do with social media, that we have citizen journalists, we have access to Gazan journalists despite the restrictions on electricity and fuel. Gazan journalists are doing everything they can to get the truth out. And that's new in a genocide. It's very new that we are living this genocide in real time. And that is making a difference to ordinary people. Ordinary people with any sense of moral gravity will be absolutely horrified by what is happening. And if you rely on the mainstream media, then you get a very skewed event, because a skewed image of what is happening, because Western media has systematically supported Israel. Israel has been seen as a strategic geopolitical strategic center for countries like the UK and United States in the Middle East. It's been praised as the only democracy in the Middle East. I mean, and how can you call a country democratic if half the population don't have the right to vote effectively? How can you call a country a democracy if it operates on the basis of apartheid? For Jewish Israelis, yeah, they live in a democracy, but for all Palestinians in the country, that's absolutely not the case. So I think that, yes, we are witnessing, because we have access now through social media platforms like Twitter, like Instagram, access to what is actually happening on the ground, and that's a new phenomenon. And for young people in particular, I mean, if you think about pro-Palestinian demonstrations 10 years ago, 20 years ago, it was always older people. It was always a particular and small core of older activists. Now, the demonstrations are filled with young people and families and people who have access to what is the truth about what is happening, and that's new.
That's so true, and that's and hopefully, I believe we have turned a corner, and we are seeing a live genocide, and that will not be able to, well, that fact cannot be erased from the minds and the memories of the people who are watching what's happening, the monstrous acts that's been unfolding in Gaza. So We will pray and hope the killing stops. I just want to thank you and thank your team for putting this statement out. I think it's a really powerful statement. It's on our website for those who want to go and read it. Please have a look on MEMO's website and you'll find it. The title of the article we published on that is "Annihilation of Palestinians Began with the Balfour Declaration, say international experts." That's the article which is referencing the statement. I want to thank Professor Penny Green for joining us, and also thank you at home for tuning in, and I hope to see you in another conversation with the Middle East Monitor. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.